As we approach today's reading, we find Jesus in the small town of Capernaum. Now, he's been teaching here for a while. This little fishing village is a familiar place to Jesus. He stayed here quite a bit in the home of Peter. This town was home to one of the oldest synagogues. Judaism was well established in this small town. I can imagine that this blue-collar town, with fishing as the main industry, was a great backdrop for Jesus to find and seek those who wanted to understand how faith impacts daily life. You know, fishing is a tough industry with a tough people. Now, Jesus garnered a lot of attention everywhere he went, especially here. His fame as a healer and teacher caused people to want to be close to him, to see what he would do, to hear his teachings. Now, there was a certain man, an important person. He was part of the synagogue. No doubt everyone knew who he was because he was a prominent person there. Even if they weren't sure who he was, the clothes that he wore and the accessories that he had as a ruler in the house of worship made him stand out. People knew he was important. But when he found Jesus this one day, his positional authority, his acclaim as a religious leader, none of that mattered. His daughter was dying, and he fell to his knees in front of Jesus and he begged him for help. I mean, you can imagine your daughter, a young woman, just at the beginning of her life, is so sick that she's nearly dead. Jairus had exhausted all of his efforts to help his daughter. But Jesus, well, he was Jairus' last hope. Jesus was moved by Jairus' request to go and lay hands and heal his daughter. He stopped teaching and he followed Jairus. But on his way, following this desperate dad, along with his disciples, the village people went along too. They wanted to see what would happen. So just picture this with me for a moment. You have this religious leader dressed up in his fine clothes. Jesus and his disciples are following him, and the crowd is growing as they move towards Jairus' house to see what would happen. Now, Jesus was a rabbi, but he didn't wear the same type of fancy clothing that this synagogue leader had on. But one thing they were both wearing was something like this. This is a tallit. The tallit has the origins in the Torah, and most Jewish men wore one at all times, but certainly all rabbis wore one. As they moved along, the crowd began to push and shove, trying to get close to Jesus. And in the chaos of this parade, there was something that happened. Now, it wasn't a dramatic or intense occurrence that would have been noticed by anyone, but when this special display of faith happened, Jesus knew it. See, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, a woman who had been excluded from any reasonable quality of life that involved being with others. She was considered unclean, unfit for even normal existence. She was excluded from anything to do with the synagogue. In her desperation for 12 years to be healed, she spent every penny she had trying to find a doctor that could heal her. Nothing worked. And this woman, she was broke and broken. She didn't come screaming aloud for help in the crowd that day. In fact, she didn't want any attention. But she had faith. And this woman, without fancy clothing or a position that could get her ready access to Jesus, she determined in her heart, she said, if I can get just close enough to touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. And that's what happened. A woman that we don't know her name, we really don't know much about her other than she certainly was not an intricate part of this society. A woman who was an outsider, not well established, not welcomed anywhere, was in desperate need. She knew that Jesus was her only hope. But nevertheless, this woman, just like Jairus, shared something in common. Jesus was her last hope. And without a miracle from him, where would her sickness lead? We know for sure it would have led to more isolation, but it might have led to death. She pressed through the chaos of that crowd that day and touched the hem of his garment. And when she did, Jesus stopped everything. He felt the power of healing leave him. And he said, "Who touched me?" She came to him in fear and trembling. Jesus responded to her and said, "Take heart, my daughter. Be healed of your disease." See, this type of faith that she had moved Jesus. She knew that Jesus was her last hope. And this type of faith is the type of faith that says there's not a plan B. Tried everything else. And she said, "Only in Jesus will I find life." This made her just like Jairus. No plan B. Either Jesus would come through or nothing good would have happened at all. Well, Jesus spent time with her, and as he was focused on her, encouraging her faith, someone came with the news that Jairus' daughter had died. They told Jairus it was useless to bother Jesus any longer. It was useless to ask Jesus for anything now. In their view, death had conquered and the girl was dead. However, Jesus looked at Jairus and he said, "Don't you give up now. Don't be afraid. Keep believing. Keep trusting in me." When they got to where this little girl's body lay, the family was living into the custom of their day. They were being loud and demonstrating their mourning. In fact, it was required of the Jews that a commotion be fabricated, even hiring mourners to come. Now, we don't know if she'd been dead long enough in this exchange of time, if the hired mourners had arrived or not, but we do know that there were family and friends in mourning. And Jesus confronted those making the commotion and he said, "She's asleep." And they laughed. Well, Jesus dismissed them, told them to go away because they weren't there in faith. They had their eyes on the circumstances. He gathered the mother and the father and 3 of his disciples, and he approached the young girl and he knelt over her and he said something to her, and she was healed. She was so healed, she got up and started walking around. But what did he say to her? There's quite a bit of discussion among scholars about the phrase "talitha kumi," having to do with Greek and Aramaic, and it's kind of a complicated conversation that takes place. In the scriptures we read today, it just is simply given to us as, "Little girl, get up." Now, before I say something about what Jesus said, I want to make it very clear that the most important thing we see in this story is that Jesus was motivated by faith. Faith of the woman with the issue of blood, faith by Jairus, the kind of faith that says Jesus is the answer. Because the truth is, Jesus is your answer. He's my answer. Jesus is the real source of our healing and our hope, and He's the only one that can give us a life that matters. And this happens when you put all your trust in Him. But just for a fun thought, this phrase, Talitha Kumi. The word Talitha, it looks a lot like the word Talit. In my imagination, what I see is that Jesus knelt over this girl and He said, "Get up." And when she did, she came into His prayer covering. A prayer covering that has 613 strings. It's a memorization tool to help rabbis remember all the law. But Jesus being the fulfillment of the law, does away with the need for this. It reminds me of a little scripture in Malachi 4:2 that says, "When the Son of Righteousness comes, He will come with healing in His wings." When Jesus came, fulfilling all the law, fulfilling all the promises that He would make for Himself a people that would be in relationship, a people who would respond, that by putting their hope and trust in Him would get up and walk as if to say they have a real life, a life worth living.